Welcome to this lecture on structural geology. This will just be a one-part lecture. It's about half an hour long. And we'll start out today with this motivating question. Earlier this week, we talked about metamorphic rocks and how as pressure and temperature increase, they create foliation. Now, I'd like to bring this into a larger conceptual diagram of the Earth and the crust and think about how rock layers will respond to increasing pressure and temperature conditions. And I'd like you to show at least 3 stages. So think of one block of rock, maybe add a couple layers to it, and then think about under initially small pressure temperature, larger pressure temperature, and then lastly, even greater pressures and temperatures, how this rock will deform. And then at the end of this, we'll check our knowledge. All right, so before we get started today, this is really going to be a lecture that is focused on stress and strain. Stress, is important to remember, is the force that is applied to an object. So it is technically the force over area, whereas strain is the deformation that results from that stress. We can actually mathematically express strain often as the ratio of the deformed length to the original length. So just some examples here of strain. You have a paper clip that has been permanently strained and deformed by the stress of you pulling at it. You've got this really appetizing American cheese that is being stressed through shear stress. So that's showing, these arrows are showing the direction the person is pulling. It is shear because it is parallel to the area. And then in the center here, we have some breakage, which is the deformation or the strain resulting from this shear. So when we think of these two terms geologically, we tend to think of plate tectonic motion as providing the stress. Whether or not this stress and strain is going on at a plate boundary, there is often intraplate stresses that again are driven by plate tectonic motion that are stressing the rocks. And the stress is going to result in deformation or strain. This is really the realm of the field of structural geology. So structural geologists are really concerned with using deformation and strain to relate that back to the stresses that were in that environment. And ultimately, usually the goal is to think about what's going on a larger scale, on the plate tectonic scale. I mean, it's through this that we've been able to reconstruct past worlds and also how we've been able to predict how rocks will deform, whether it is in sudden breaks like earthquakes, or whether they're able to deform through a ductile, smoother motion that will not cause any hazards. Studying strain can be done in multiple ways. So just to show some examples, we have some structural geologists who use analog models. So you can think of these as like sandbox models in which we can reproduce conditions on Earth, but at a much smaller scale. So for example, we have many of these analog models sprinkled throughout the basement of Palmer Hall that we use for teaching and a little bit for research as well. And that allows us, as you can see in this GIF here, to basically watch how the rock layers will start to fault and fold as tectonic stresses are induced. So an example here might be, this is kind of somewhat similar to what we see at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, particularly near Glacier National Park. You'll see a lot of rocks exposed that look quite similar to the layers you're seeing here, and these stacked or imbricated thrust faults, which are a form of reverse faulting. Structural geologists will also use field observations. So they are traditionally more one of the field-heavy branches of geology, which they use those field observations of strained rocks and the orientation of the strain, and therefore the orientation of the stresses, to figure out what's been going on in the past. So through this, we've been able to reconstruct past plate motions. There's also lots of laboratory tests that can be done. This is an example of a Brazilian shear test that just shows how rocks actually break and the mechanics of rock fracture. And when we think about strain geologically as well as just kind of overall, there are two main types of strain that we'll think about. The first is ductile, in which rocks bend. The second is brittle, in which rocks break. And the same rock can behave under ductile or under brittle conditions depending on what the surrounding environment is like. So one of the main controls in whether rocks are ductile or brittle is going to be the temperature. So a higher temperature will allow more ductile movement, simply because the atoms, the molecules that make up that material are going to be a little bit looser, and it will be easier for them to maintain their crystal structure while bending, versus a tighter crystal lattice and tighter atoms may not allow for that, and you will get brittle fracture at lower temperatures. Another important feature is the confining pressure. So if something is buried at greater depths and has more confining pressure, then we tend to see things like ductile deformation. However, this is also going to depend on what the style and rate of the stress is. So these two diagrams on the right here are emphasizing this. We're looking at temperature increasing to the right and pressure increasing as we go down, kind of mirroring how pressure increases with depth within the earth. And rocks will behave differently depending on the pressure and temperature conditions, as well as the type of stress. So you'll notice that this one on the left here is tension, and there are many more conditions in which rocks will behave in a brittle fashion in tensional stress. However, when we look at compressional, that zone of brittle deformation becomes much smaller, confined mostly to pressures less than 1 or 1,000 atmospheric pressure, and temperatures less than 500 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, for most rocks, we see deformation behaving in a ductile fashion under compressive stresses. And then, of course, one that's important to think about, especially as geologists, is the rock composition. So when rocks have a tighter locking between the grains, it is harder for those rocks to bend. So if you have interlocked crystals, like in an igneous or a metamorphic rock, those crystals, because they're so locked, will not bend very easily. They're going to tend to have to break in more of a brittle failure. In contrast, rocks like shales they can bend pretty ductily fairly easily. Sandstones are another example where you have highly cemented grains. So there's that high interlocking of the grains, and those are going to tend to be more brittle. All right, and so when we get brittle strain, this is going to result in the formation of things like faults. We talked about faults earlier in this class, but these are essentially planar surfaces that separate two offset materials. And this can be on multiple scales. So on the far left here, we have an example of a fault that bounds two tectonic plates. So this is an image of the San Andreas Fault. And that fault is this linear valley here going straight through the landscape. We can also have faults within one rock block that accommodate more regional stresses. So this is in the middle, an example where we have meters of offset, and this is looking at a road outcrop. So right in front of us is the curb of that road, and a car would perhaps be something like that scale. And then finally, we can also get faults occurring on a much smaller scale where only centimeters to millimeters of offset actually occurs. So this is another example on the right in which we have a much smaller scale of offset. The other type of strain is ductile strain, and this is what most of today will be focused on. So we've already covered earthquakes before, and that's going to be on the brittle strain side of things. Today is going to be about ductile strain, how we make folds within rocks, and what types of shear result in those folds. So that's the focus for today. And just like with brittle strain, ductile strain can occur at a range of scales. So we have here some folds in rocks on the scale of mountains. So if you can follow these layers, they're doing kind of something like this. So we've got some large, almost kilometer scale folding. And then we have a quarry here where we have meter scale folding. And again, you can see this nicely in the banded rock colors. And then on a much smaller scale of centimeters and decimeters, note the pencil for scale, we can also get some folding. And there can be folds on top of folds. So within this large kilometer scale fold, you may see invisible to the eye at this current scale, but if you zoomed in, you might see some smaller folds on top, imposed on top of this larger fold. All right, so what actually causes a fold? There are three main stress types that will lead to ductile strain and to ductile folding. So the first of these is longitudinal. And this is going to be a case where the stresses are normal to the surface. So if you look at these red arrows, these represent the compressive stresses, and the compressive stresses are acting normal to that surface. The tensional or extensional stresses are acting normal to that surface, right? And normal here is going to be defined as being at a right angle to that surface. So if you have this body and you squeeze it, you're going to elongate it as this second picture shows here. In contrast to this, where the stress is normal, we often see in reality a lot of shear stress. So a simple shear is going to be where we have this box of material and the forces or the stress is acting parallel to the surface of the material, as you can see in these arrows here. And if you imagine, if you do this, a great analogy for this, if you take a stack of cards, those are index cards or playing cards, and then you hold them between your hands like this and slowly move your hands in the opposite direction, what you get is those stack of cards will rotate and elongate, exactly like what this image shows here. So this is simple shear. It is some rotation of the material and elongation of it. And we define the amount of shear, the stress that occurs through the tangent of the offset angle. All right, the last type of these shears is pure shear. And the setup for this looks very similar to simple shear, and the end result looks very similar to longitudinal shear. So this is a case where we have shear stresses, and rather than involving rotation, it involves just pure shearing of that material. And so you end up with this elongate form where there hasn't really been any rotation. All right, so when we look at rocks, we're often going to see things that look like this example here. Can you identify what type of shear or what type of stress this is? It may help to first trace out the layers. So here we'll trace out what some of these layers are doing. And so it looks like here we are seeing some rotation, particularly in the center. So right where these layers are most deformed, there is some rotation, and it would seem the sense rotation is some shear along the top of the original material. So this is an example of simple shear. So these types of stress, shear and longitudinal stress, are going to result in ductile deformation within the rocks, which is going to form a feature called folds. And that's what we'll focus on for the rest of this lecture. Folds are going to form in response to compressive stress. And the reason we're going to focus on compressive stress, particularly here, is because if you remember several slides back, under extensional or tensional stresses, most rocks under most temperature and pressure conditions are going to behave brittly. And so most of the ductile response that we see in rocks is going to be from compressive stresses. If you imagine on the top here, this is our original block of rock. Say this is the crust of some plate. Under a brittle condition, this would lead to brittle strain and faulting. But if you're greater than a few kilometers depth and you're fairly warm, you're going to get ductile strain and folding of the rocks occurring. So that's going to create shortening of that layer as it folds on itself, and the total length will then be smaller. And it's important to note before we go on that although all of our examples of folds are going to be pictures of folds of the Earth's surface, we need to remember that these folds are actually formed below the surface. So they need to be under some pressure conditions, right? If you refer back to that diagram of pressure and temperature and compressional stresses, most ductile deformation is going to be occurring below about 1 kilobar of pressure. So you need to be a few kilometers deep in the crust in order to get there. So these folds are forming deep in the crust, and then everything above them is being eroded away such that the folds are left on the surface. So it's important to remember that even though we see examples like this one on the left here, where the fold seems to correlate with topography, that actually topography is formed through erosion, like by rivers and glaciers and wind, and the folds are formed by tectonic stresses at depth. In this case, on the left here, what we may have is a particularly strong layer of rock, and that's forming a layer that is resistant to erosion, and that creates some linkage between topography and the folding. Just another spectacular example of a fold here with a car for scale on the right. And these, you can see here, the kind of thick layers have one single fold. And as you get into the middle of the fold, you have layers with slightly different material properties. And so they're able to ductily deform in much tighter folds at a smaller scale than these folds on the outside here. You can see another example right where I'm circling, where we have another layer that is able to fold on a tighter scale. And that's going to be due just to the material properties of whatever is making up that layer. Perhaps this large layer is a sandstone, and these smaller layers contain a little bit more silt in them. All right, so there's several different fold types, and we'll go over the definitions of those now. The first one is an anticline. This is a fold that forms under compression, as all of these do, and it's a case where the rocks are moving up to form an A-shaped form. So that's how I remember anticline. An anticline forms an A-shaped form. And importantly, in geology, we remember that it forms an A-shaped form, but in doing so, it keeps the oldest rocks, the rocks in the bottom of the stack, in the center of the fold, right? So the youngest rocks are on the outside and the oldest rocks are on the inside. And this is important because, despite this example on the right here, erosion that brings this fold to the surface may take away that A-shaped form. So it may actually, in this image, cut everything away like this. And so what you may be left with in order to identify the fold type is the actual rock ages. And the rock ages would confirm that the oldest rocks are on the inside of this fold. Folds exist on a continuum. So if you were to take a sheet of paper and compress it, you notice the center of this paper is forming an anticline, an A-shaped fold, right? But on either side of this, the folds are forming a sink. So it's transitioning immediately from an anticline into a different type of fold, which is called a syncline. And this is essentially the opposite of an anticline in the sense that the layers are now folded down instead of being folded up. And because they're folded down, or they're sinking, which is how I remember syncline, the youngest rocks are now going to be in the center, right? So as those rocks are sinking down, the youngest rocks form the center of the syncline. And that's going to be, in terms of the rock dating, the way we can tell anticlines and synclines apart. This is especially important because the A shape and the sink shape that I've used to remember these, those occur if we have a fold that has been subject to stresses that are equal on either side. However, we do often get cases where stresses are not equal. For instance, one of my hands is moving closer to the other hand at a much faster rate. And that forms folds that are no longer at this perfectly upright angle, as we've seen the upright angle shown in this picture and on the diagram. And so this gives us folds that can actually overturn. And so that original A shape that defined the anticline could turn over and actually could turn the whole way over so that it looks like a syncline, but the rock ages would confirm that the oldest rocks are indeed in the center and that it is an anticline. So just to back up and kind of go over how those changing stress fields would result in different fold forms. In this diagram here, we can see how we're starting out with a symmetric anticline. And so there's an axis to this anticline and an axial plane that runs right through the center of this anticline, and it is oriented perfectly vertically, so it's upright. However, if we were to increase the stresses coming from the left direction, that would sort of tilt the anticline over. And so we start to get things that are called asymmetric folds in the second stage here, where one side of the fold is longer or at a different angle than the other side of the fold. And if we drew a plane through the axes of these folds, that plane would now be at an angle. This asymmetry can continue until you start to overfold, which is shown in this square here, where now the rocks are starting to overturn a little bit and we're disrupting that original superposition, right? So in all of the images on all of the parts of the diagram on the left half, we have our oldest rocks on the bottom and our youngest rocks on the top. And as we get into overfolds and recumbent folds, that order can be flipped so that the older rocks are put on top of younger rocks. And then we can also eventually get to a location where we have folds that are lying down. We call these recumbent folds because they look like they're reclining, they're in their recumbent form. And it's really interesting to see from this diagram, if you follow this bottom layer, as you progress in asymmetry, this bottom layer is able to fold well in a symmetric fold. It gets a little bit tighter on one side in the asymmetric fold. And then in the overfold, the angle that it has to make at the very center of the fold becomes very tight. And eventually that angle becomes tight enough that the rock can no longer ductily deform. And in this last picture we have is actually a little bit of brittle deformation within the rock at depth that in the other layers remains ductile. And this is a really nice way to see how faults may look at depth. So often we have what are called blind faults, and they may underlie a fold at the surface. So as you go with depth and the layers get closer and closer together in these tighter folds, you could get a fault forming. And as you go further up, closer to the surface, the angle isn't as tight anymore. And so you have more of folding and ductile deformation. So it's a good reminder that brittle and ductile deformation can be a continuum, that it depends on the rock types and their own properties in terms of how well they can move ductily. Yep. All right. So as we just mentioned, folding and faulting are often related. In the example that I showed, we were just looking at one snapshot in time and we couldn't really tell which one came first. And this is often a challenge with folds and faults that are related. It can be hard to tell which of them came first. If we had a nice time series, like these diagrams on the left here, we might be able to tell more. So this is an example here where we have some folding that becomes recumbent and that leads to a fault. And this fault is a reverse fault. And it's a specific type of reverse fault that is actually called a thrust fault. A thrust fault occurs at a low angle. And so in this progression, we start out with flat parallel bedding. It gets folded. Those folds become tighter. And as they become tighter, these rock layers at depth start to fracture. And we get the emergence of a fault plane through those rocks, which then that faulting and that brittle motion starts to take over as the dominant form of deformation. On the example on the left here, we see something that's a little bit more complicated. Rather than a snapshot in time, or rather than a time series, we're now looking at a snapshot in time. I've outlined for you a fault plane. So those are these red lines that I'm now emphasizing. And then some lines coming up towards that fault that represent the layering within the rock. And you can see that these rocks, even though they are offset across the fault, also contain some folding. And that folding seems to be really heightened and associated with the fault. So what happened? Did we have folding, some ductile deformation, that then led to brittle deformation? Or did we have brittle deformation and fault movement and fault drag? So that is something that is common along faults, is that fault movement may drag some of the layers with it. And so you get these small scale folds associated with a fault. So in this case, on the picture on the left, we actually don't have an answer for which came first. All right, so those were anticlines and synclines. However, we have another type of fold called a monocline. And unlike anticlines and synclines that exist in this continuum where you transfer from an anticline to a syncline to an anticline to a syncline, monoclines are going to occur on their own. So they are just a single bend in the rock and they flatten out on either end. So they're characterized by flat rock, a tilt to the rock, and then flat rock again. And a really nice example of a monocline is one that runs through the Grand Canyon. It's underlain at depth by faults. So we know that within the schist, which is a crystalline rock and therefore more brittle than the overlying sedimentary rocks, we know that this schist contains faults, probably about 2 faults. And the motion along these faults has caused some deformation within the overlying sedimentary rocks. However, because of these sedimentary rock characteristics, these have been able to deform ductily to form this monocline. And on the right here is an image of this same monocline that's shown in the diagram. You can see the flat rock layers on the left side have then dive down and flatten out again on the right. We can also get something called a dome, which is again formed by folding. So examine this image here. Each of the different colors is a different rock layer. So you've got this kind of black gray rock layer, a red layer, green layer, some darker layers in there, all forming these concentric rings around the center. So what if this oldest rock, we dated all of these rocks and the oldest rock was in the center? What would we call this? And try and figure it out with your hands. So if you have your hands placed like this, and you want your oldest rocks, so the rocks below your hands to be in the center, how do you get that to occur? If we were thinking in just one dimension, right, that would be an anticline. But here we want that to occur in 3 dimensions. So this is a feature called a dome, and it's surrounded by anticlinal motion. So if you were to take a cutaway into the subsurface, you would see an anticline on each side. So on this side, as well as on this side here, are anticlines. And that results in, if you bulge up the earth material, you're going to bring up the oldest rock in the center. Conversely, if the youngest rock was in the center, that means rather than bringing rock up, you are bringing it down in the center of the structure, and that's a basin form. That basin form is bounded by synclines on both sides and has the youngest rock in the center. Again, part of that downwelling. So if we look on geologic maps and we're only looking at colors, it's often hard to tell which of these features we're looking at. And so we use a notation called strike and dip in order to inform us what type of fold it is that we're examining. The strike and dip symbol looks similar to what I have here. So this is the strike, the long line, and that is telling you what direction the axial plane or the axis is running in. So for instance, if you were looking on the side of this symmetrical fold here, the rock layers are running this way. That allows you to keep at the same elevation across that rock layer. The dip is how steeply that rock layer is tilted. The dip angle is the angle of steepest descent. So if you were to take a marble and roll it down this bedding layer, the dip direction is the direction that the marble would roll in. And that helps define the strike. The strike is 90 degrees from that dip. So it's where you could travel at, or sort of contour along that bedding layer. The actual dip angle here is how steep the layer is dipping from horizontal. So 45 degrees here would indicate we have a rock layer that is tilted 45 degrees down from horizontal. In 3 dimensions, that might look something like this. So here we take that same strike and dip symbol with 45 degrees, and you can see the top of this box is what it would look like from the surface. We see these parallel layers. And if we were to cut away into the subsurface, each of these parallel layers would be tilted in the direction of the dip, and they would be tilted from horizontal at an angle of 45 degrees. All right, so let's play around with this. Here we have a box model. We've got the layers oriented by number. So layer number 5, 4, 3, 4, 5, 5, and 4 again. And my pen has stopped working, so I will no longer be able to annotate with it, it seems. So draw here what you think these layers would look like. We've got the dips shown on the top. So for example, if we take layer 4, on this side, we have a dip direction towards the right. And so if we take the boundary between 4 and 5, we know that should be dipping towards the right. We don't have an angle, but we can match it up with this 5 to 4 boundary that's shown on the side of the box. We'll do that same thing with the boundary between 3 and 4. And we'll try and keep that parallel to the first line that I drew. The reason I'm keeping it parallel is because I want layer 4 to have the same thickness throughout the entire box. In general, sedimentary rocks should not change their thickness. And so when we're drawing these box diagrams, that's one thing that we want to keep in mind, is that each layer should retain a similar thickness. On the other side of this box model, we have the dip now going in the opposite direction. And so we can draw that between 5 and 4, and then between 4 and 3. Now what happens to layer 3? Well, we have here notated the fold axis. So that would be the area where there is no folding, basically the top of the fold. So that indicates there's probably a fold, perhaps looks something like this at depth. And we'll check that. So underneath my notations, which will clear really quickly, you can see what the artists decided to do here. Rather than drawing straight lines, they curved them. Most folds will have these curved lines to them. And they've also added in some extra layers that would be present below layer 3. So let's imagine layer 1 is the oldest. If layer 1 is the oldest, then what type of fold is this? This would be an upright anticline if layer 1 was the oldest. If layer 1 was the youngest, however, that would make this, at least age-wise, follow the pattern of a syncline. However, since the dip angles are going opposite of how a syncline should go, this would indicate that the syncline has been overturned. So it is now upside down from its original position. All right, here's another box model to play with. Take just a minute or however you need, pause and try and sketch out what that covered face would be. All right, so hopefully you came up with something similar to this. All the layers are dipping in the same direction, and that was to the left or to the right. All right, then we have another example here, and now we actually have the dip angles. So in addition to the dip directions that we just played with, you now know how steeply they're dipping from horizontal. And when you're ready, we can move on. Oh, and apparently does not. It does not release the annotations. But this should be a very similar form to this first fold that we drew here, where we've got an anticline with two limbs dipping away from each other at 30 degrees. All right, we have some more block models for you to play with. So here we have concentric rings that might be either a basin or might be a dome. So how can we use the strike and dips to tell these apart? Think for a couple minutes, come up with a hypothesis, and when you're ready, unpause and we'll continue. All right, so we'll look at this first model. So here we have dips that are going away from the center. And so if you were to model that with your hands, you take your hands and you're dipping them away from something in the center, and you do this in 3D, that would create a dome-like structure. Conversely, on the bottom where we have dips that are pointed towards the center of the dome, with your hands, right, you'd be dipping your hands towards the center, towards each other, and that creates a sink-like form. If you do this in 3D, that would create a basin. Okay, so that's just some practice with those block diagrams. Let's return to our original motivating question though, in which I asked you to sketch a schematic diagram of how rock layers would respond to increasing pressures and temperatures. So now that we've learned more about the difference between brittle and ductile deformation, the conditions under which we get ductile deformation, and the different types of ductile deformation, I'd like you to take that diagram and revise it. Think about how your thinking has changed from the beginning of the lecture to the end and how your diagram has adjusted. And now that we have terminology, I'd like you to, in your revised diagram, include the terms. So if you expect to see anticlines and synclines or a monocline, be sure to note that in your diagram. For your homework, I'd just like you to turn in your diagrams from the beginning and the end, and then add about 2 sentences, a little bit more on how your ideas have changed.